Next year, the Boulton and Watt steam engines were introduced to power the cotton spinning machines. This was the big bang of the first industrial revolution. Now, up to that time, cotton machines were not operated by an engine of any kind. They were operated by humans, or animals at best. But I don't know if that's even possible. It probably happened somewhere. But certainly human power operated the looms and stuff. By the early 1860s, the price of cotton cloth in terms of gold bullion was less than 1% what it had been in 1784. So 80 years on, its value has fallen by 99%, its price, its cost. So what happened between 1784 and 1860? There's no previous instance in world history of the price of a product in potentially universal demand coming down so fast. In other words, everyone can use this, everyone may want this. Why then, with universally demand, everybody needs it, why then would it be so cheap after all this time? Wouldn't its value go up if everybody needs it? But as a result of this all, coming down in price and stuff, hundreds of millions of people all over the world were able to dress comfortably and cleanly at last. So it was a revolution in hygiene. Now, perhaps it looks like he's belaboring a point, but there were charges made by socialists in the 1800s and even in the 1900s, Marxists, who went back over history and they said, look, we used to wear wool clothing. Wool lasts a long time. One person has a wool shirt and they can wear it for a generation. It can last 10, 20 years. Cotton has to be replaced every year. So they said, look, industrialization is making us poorer. We're wearing poorer clothing. We can't even afford as good clothing as we used to. So that's all that fallacy. But continuing with the quote here, but there was a price to be paid, and the black slaves paid it. The new British cotton industry was ravenous for new cotton, for raw cotton. As the demand grew, the American South first began to grow cotton for export in the 1780s. The first American cotton bale arrived in Liverpool in 1784. Then, abruptly, at the turn of the century, American exports were transformed by the widespread introduction of the cotton gin. This was the invention of Eli Whitney. He was born in 1765, died in 1825. You all know that. Everybody knows the story of the goddamn cotton gin. It's the only thing we know about the 1800s. Cotton gin freed the slaves. By 1800 to 1810, his gins had made the United States the chief supplier of cotton to the British manufacturing industry's rapidly rising demand. In 1810, Britain was consuming 79 million pounds of raw cotton, of which 48% came from the American South. 20 years later, imports were 248 million, up from 79 million, 70% coming from the South, American South. In 1860, the total was over 1,000 million pounds, or a billion pounds, 92% from southern plantations. During the same period, the cost in Liverpool landing prices fell from 45 cents a pound to as low as 28 cents. So the price didn't fall that far. Production increased gargantuanly from 79 units to 1,000 units. That's in 50 years, from 79 units to 1,000 units. Maybe not as spectacular as could be, but it's pretty spectacular. We're going to skip down just a bit. The huge growth in the cotton industry made possible by Whitney's genius, it rose at 7% compound annually, soon made cotton not only America's largest export, but the biggest single source of its growing wealth. It also created the South as a special phenomenon, a culture, a cast of mind. Skipping down a page, the founding fathers from Virginia, who owned slaves, like Jefferson and Madison, and who hated slavery, had taken consolation from their belief that it was an outmoded and inefficient institution which would die out naturally or be easy to abolish. Madison, quote, spoke often and anxiously of slave property as the worst possible for profit. He used to say, now anyone who believes that the South needed its slaves to survive, just look at the fact that the South was economically backwards, you know. That it's nonsense. Slavery's not good for an economy. He used to say that Richard Rush's 10-acre farm, a free farm near Philadelphia, brought in more money than his own 2,000-acre one worked by slaves. And it is true that in Russia serfdom, the form of slavery practiced there was economically outmoded and slowly dying. But in America, Madison's views were out of date by 1810. By the early 1820s, a new kind of large-scale specialist cotton plantation, worked by hundreds of slaves, began to dominate the trade. Now, as you may know, in 1808 it became illegal to import slaves to the United States. So from 1808 onwards, any growth in slave population had to come from America itself. I had wondered about this in the past, and I thought then that means that breeding of humans would have become valuable at some point. The big plantations were in turn supplied by specialist, highly commercial slave breeding plantations. With monogamous marriages, only 10 to 15% of female slaves produced a child in any given year. Plantations which sold slaves for the market ensured regular provision of sires for all nubile females, so that up to 40% of female slaves produced a child each year. So that is really dehumanizing, to be put in a breeding factory. The notion that Southern slavery was an old-fashioned institution, a hangover from the past, was false. He says that in spite of the fact that everybody in world history had slavery. The notion that slavery was a hangover from the past was false, so take that as you will. It was a product of the Industrial Revolution, high technology, and the commercial spirit for catering for mass markets of hundreds of millions worldwide. Is that true? Slavery that went way, way back to the time of the pharaohs and the Greeks, and slavery that had to be outlawed actively by the British Empire in 1838, and slavery that was actively outlawed in all kinds of countries across the world. And he says it was actually an invention of the Industrial Revolution. It's the most vulgar thing I've read in all my readings recently. That is why it proved so difficult to eradicate. Now, its productivity in the American system made it difficult to eradicate. But that doesn't mean that it was a phenomenon of the American system. The value of the slaves themselves formed up to 35% of the entire capital of the South. By mid-century, their value was over $2 billion in gold. That was one reason compensation was ruled out. It would have amounted to at least 10 times the entire federal budget. In other words, America's economic productivity was so massive that the slaves were valued so highly that this idea, the British just purchased slaves and set them free. I believe Ron Paul has a video where he suggests that we should have done that instead, kill 500,000 men. But the value of the slaves was too high. That was totally unpractical. It would have taken 10 times the federal budget, he says. So then we say, okay, then we're going to fight a war, a little skirmish or whatever. We didn't see it was going to kill 500,000 men. So it's all fine to have 20/20 hindsight, but looking at the value of those slaves, I mean, what if you just said, we're going to go and purchase all of these houses that have just been put on the housing market by this bubble burst thing, you know, and people can't pay their mortgages. So the government's just going to buy all these houses. That'll fix the problem. Where is the government going to get 10 times its national federal budget for the year? With so much money invested in slavery, it was not surprising that the South ceased to apologize for slavery and began to defend it. Skipping down a page. To understand the level of sophistication and the passionate sincerity with which slavery was defended, we must look at the case of John C. Calhoun. We are actually not going to spend too much time on him. 1782 to 1850 of South Carolina. So if you want to know more about the defense of slavery, he was admired as a patrician of the New World. Calhoun was one of the greatest of all American political figures, a distinguished member of both houses of Congress, a superb orator, a notable member of the cabinet, and a political theorist of no mean accomplishment. Paul here asserts that Calhoun's, quote, these are the names of his books, Disquisition on Government and Discourse on the Constitution and Government of the United States. These were published in 1851.